A public health fair in a quiet southern town, meant to bring healing, not harm, until a racist cop decides to humiliate a black woman in front of an entire community. But what he doesn't know is, she's not just any woman. She's Dr. Amara Harper, brilliant, composed, and absolutely unwilling to be broken. What begins as a public act of humiliation quickly spirals into something far greater, a reckoning. A test of truth, dignity, and the strength it takes to stand when the world wants you to kneel. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends until we get there. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. On a sweltering Saturday afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama, the kind of heat that made the sidewalks shimmer and the air feel thick as syrup, Dr. Amara Harper stood beneath a white canopy tent at the edge of a bustling community plaza, gently pressing a stethoscope to a little boy's chest. The sounds of the city faded behind the rhythms of gospel music playing from a nearby speaker, blending with the cheerful chatter of families gathered for the free summer health fair. Children weaved through folding tables, chasing balloons handed out by volunteers, while elderly neighbors sat beneath shade umbrellas, sipping sweet tea and waiting patiently for blood pressure screenings. Amara moved with practiced calm, offering warm smiles, soft encouragements, and medical advice with the grace of someone who had made healing her mission, not just in hospitals, but in places like this, where healthcare was often a stranger. "Deep breath in, sweetie," she murmured, her voice steady but kind, kneeling beside the boy, whose worried grandmother clutched her handbag a little tighter with each passing second. "And out. Good job. His lungs sound clear, nothing to worry about today." The woman's shoulders dropped as she exhaled, relief visible on her weathered face. "God bless you, Dr. Harper," she whispered, and Amara just smiled, brushing a curl from her forehead as she stood and stretched her back. Sweat lined her collarbone and her silk blouse clung lightly to her skin, but she didn't mind. She had trained in far hotter places, field hospitals in Kuwait, crowded clinics in Baton Rouge after hurricanes. And today, no matter how high the sun climbed, this plaza felt like purpose. Around her, the fair hummed with quiet joy, a barbershop quartet tuning up on one corner, a mobile dental truck parked beside the playground, and seniors swapping stories in folding chairs as if decades hadn't passed since they'd first marched. And for dignity, Amara paused a moment to take it all in, shielding her eyes with one hand as she scanned the crowd, searching not for danger, but for anyone left unseen. That was how she'd been raised, by parents who believed that real care meant noticing the overlooked, the unheard, the invisible. So, even now, when she had every reason to rest, to let the volunteers handle things, she found herself checking every line, every table, every face. Doc called out one of the EMTs she'd trained last month. "We've got a guy complaining of chest tightness near the front steps." She gave a quick nod and started moving her footsteps light, but focused the heels of her loafers, clicking gently on the brick path. She moved like someone who belonged, not just because she was admired here, but because she had earned it. With every life she'd touched, with every hour volunteered on weekends when she could have been catching up on sleep or charts or her own loneliness, Amara had built trust, the old-fashioned way, one wound at a time, one kindness at a time. One promise kept. But beneath the surface of her calm, she knew the tightrope she walked. She was young for a doctor, especially a black woman doctor, and beautiful in a way that often made people notice her for the wrong reasons. She'd learned how to smile without inviting, how to be warm without being read as weak, how to stay gracious when people mistook her for a nurse or assistant or even a guest. It wasn't bitterness that settled in her stomach each time it happened, just a quiet, heavy understanding that no degree, no resume, no military medals could change how some people saw her first, and only her skin, her body, her youth. Still, she came back every time. Still, she stayed. As she knelt again beside an older man seated on a bench, placing 2 fingers on his wrist to find the pulse, she heard someone laugh behind her, a carefree, belly-deep laugh, the kind that reminded her of barbecues and Sunday dinners. She turned slightly and saw Mrs. Eula, 81, and still wearing her church hat, waving her fan dramatically as she held court with 3 old friends. "That little one," Eula said, nodding toward Amara, "got more brains and backbone than half the doctors at the hospital and twice the heart." The others chuckled in agreement. Amara couldn't help but smile, her eyes softening. Praise from women like Eula wasn't flattery, it was legacy. It was a bridge from everything that had been endured to everything still possible. And for a moment, just a moment, Amara let herself breathe in the warmth around her, the laughter and music and smell of grilled corn in the air. It felt like the beginning of something good, something that might just last. Just a few blocks away from the laughter and gospel melodies of the health fair officer Bradley Cole sat in the driver's seat of his cruiser, the engine idling low as the sun baked the asphalt beneath him. His forearm rested on the open window, sweat tracing lines down his temple, but his eyes stayed locked on the distant movement of the crowd gathering near the community plaza. There was something about these kinds of events that always set his nerves on edge. Too many people, too little control, and too many reasons for things to go wrong if someone like him didn't keep an eye on it. He squinted against the light, his jaw tight, watching children run between tents, old folks chatting in folding chairs, and right at the center of it all, a young black woman moving with command and confidence, clipboard in one hand, smile on her lips like she had something to prove. Cole didn't recognize her, but he didn't need to, not really. He'd seen that type before, polished, poised, well-spoken, and just smug enough to think she couldn't be questioned. The kind that smiled at you like she'd already read your entire life story and tossed it aside as beneath her. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, a subtle rhythm of irritation building with each tick. In another time, maybe he would have just ignored it, let the day pass without incident. But lately things felt different. The department had been riding him hard after 2 formal complaints. His sergeant had pulled him aside just last week, told him in a low voice to lay low for a while, don't cause ripples. And yet sitting there watching her, watching the way everyone seemed to orbit around her like she was some damn queen of the square, it sparked something in him, something sour and familiar, the kind that started in his stomach and rose like heat in the back of his neck. A vendor in a red apron passed by offering bottled water through open windows. Cole waved him off with a flat, "I'm good," but his voice was sharp enough to make the man flinch and keep moving. He adjusted his badge and glanced back at the woman now, greeting an elderly couple with the kind of warmth he couldn't fake if he tried. Her name tag was too far to read, but it didn't matter. He'd already decided what she was, a showboat, probably a social worker or some self-appointed medical volunteer trying to look important. He grabbed his radio but paused before speaking into it, watching her crouch down to tie a child's shoelace with practiced care, then rise with a fluid, almost military discipline. "She's not even wearing scrubs," he muttered under his breath, a sarcastic edge curling the words, "Bet she left the costume at home today." He slammed the car door with more force than necessary and adjusted his belt as he started walking toward the fair. The sun pressed down harder, now the air thick like molasses, and his boots made a dull thud on the sidewalk as he approached the edge of the gathering. He didn't announce himself, just walked through the crowd like he owned the ground beneath it, nodding at no one, eyes trained on her. Amara saw him before he said a word. She straightened, handing a clipboard to a volunteer, then turned slowly, her expression calm but alert. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth but not submissive, a gentle firmness in her tone that didn't bend. Cole narrowed his eyes, took a step closer, and didn't answer right away. He looked her up and down, letting the silence stretch until it turned awkward. "You got ID?" he asked flatly, already half convinced she wouldn't. Amara blinked, confused. "Excuse me. I said, do you have identification on you?" he repeated louder this time so the people nearby could hear. Heads started turning. A mother holding her baby glanced nervously in their direction. Someone in a folding chair shifted uncomfortably. "I do," Amara replied, her voice measured, now cautious. She reached into her canvas tote and pulled out her hospital-issued badge. "Dr. Amara Harper, Pediatric Oncology, Birmingham Memorial. I'm volunteering here today." She held it out calmly, but Cole didn't take it. He just stared at her, letting the seconds drag out. "You don't look like any doctor I've ever seen," he said, his voice a little too loud now, a little too pointed. The crowd had begun to quiet. The gospel music still played from the speakers, but it now felt distant, muffled beneath the growing tension. Amara's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I assure you, officer, my credentials are real." Cole gave a humorless chuckle and shook his head. "Funny how y'all always say that," he muttered, as if speaking to no one in particular but making sure everyone heard. His hand dropped to his belt, brushing the radio, then the handcuffs, then resting again at his side. Amara took a half step back without realizing it, not in fear but in calculation. She could feel the shift in the air, how quickly a misunderstanding could turn into something irreversible when power was involved and egos weren't checked. The plaza, once filled with music and laughter, now felt like it had been hollowed out, like every sound had been sucked into a vacuum of uncertainty. And there in the center of it, under the heavy sun and the weight of countless invisible histories, Amara stood perfectly still, not out of submission, but because she understood something deeper than fear, that sometimes stillness is the last form of control a person has left. He didn't raise his voice, not at first, but the shift in his posture was enough to signal something had turned. Officer Cole took another step toward her, the leather of his duty belt creaking slightly, his shoulders squared, now lips tightened into a line that said he was done asking questions. Around them, people had begun to sense the tension. Children paused their games mid-run. A woman in scrubs stopped unpacking medical supplies, and the chatter that had once filled the plaza began to thin into a kind of waiting silence. Amara stood her ground, her heart ticking a little faster now, but her spine held straight, her hands calmly holding out the ID she had already offered once. "I already told you who I am," she said gently, but with clarity, not backing away, not blinking. "There's no reason for this escalation, officer." Cole tilted his head slightly, not as if he were confused, but as if he didn't like the tone, didn't like the way she met his gaze without apology. "What are you hiding in that bag?" he asked, gesturing with his chin toward the tote slung over her shoulder. His words weren't a question, they were an accusation wrapped in a challenge. Amara didn't move right away. Her thoughts raced, calculating the optics, the witnesses, the balance between self-protection and composure. "Medical supplies," she replied, her voice lower, now clipped by caution. "Gloves, hand sanitizer, band-aids. You're welcome to take a look, just be respectful." But that word respectful seemed to hit a nerve. Cole stepped forward so quickly that the crowd shifted with him, a ripple of murmurs following his movement like a wave pulling back before a crash. He reached out and snatched the tote from her shoulder with one hand, jerking it hard enough that she stumbled half a step before regaining balance. She didn't cry out. Instead, she turned toward him, jaw set, arms at her sides, shoulders tense but still. "There is no cause for this," she said again, quieter this time, more to herself than to him. He rifled through the bag, roughly pulling out gauze packets and antiseptic wipes, and tossing them to the ground with impatient, dismissive hands. Then he dropped the bag at her feet, eyes scanning her from head to toe like he was still hunting for something that would justify what he already wanted to do. He wasn't searching for contraband, he was searching for an excuse. "Let me see your arms," he barked suddenly, stepping closer. What she asked, baffled now, her voice rising just slightly with disbelief. "Roll up your sleeves. I want to check for needle marks." Amara blinked. "I'm a physician," she said slowly, deliberately, as though reminding herself as much as him. "You have no right to accuse me of drug use in front of patients. This is harassment." Cole's nostrils flared. "Then you got nothing to be afraid of, do you?" She took a breath. A slow, painful breath that made her chest rise and fall with measured control, because she knew what could happen if she didn't. She had heard the stories. She had seen the footage. And now she was in it. From the corner of her eye, she saw an older woman clutch her purse to her chest and step backward. A teenager held up a phone, unsure whether to record. No one moved. Everyone watched. "I'm not resisting," Amara said calmly, taking one slow step back. "But I'm not rolling up my sleeves just because you feel entitled to humiliate me." Cole's jaw clenched, and then he moved. Fast. One hand grabbed her upper arm, the other reaching toward her chest, and the next second blurred into motion and noise. The sudden snap of fabric, the gasp of someone in the crowd, the sharp tearing sound that seemed to split more than just her blouse. Her shirt tore down the front, not cleanly but violently, exposing her bra and skin and every piece of dignity he hadn't been able to touch until that moment. A child screamed. Someone shouted, "Hey!" but it was already too late. Amara froze, not out of shock, not entirely, but out of calculation. The moment you flinch, the moment you react with rage or tears, you let them write your narrative for you. So she stood there holding the edges of her shirt together, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed, not on Cole, but on the people around her. She could feel their eyes now, not admiring, not even sympathetic, just stunned, paralyzed by what they had just seen and what they did not yet know how to name. Cole stepped back half a pace, his own breath ragged now, but still postured like he believed himself in the right. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before disrespecting an officer," he muttered, almost under his breath. Amara said nothing. She didn't move, didn't tremble. Her hands now gripping the torn fabric across her chest felt the sting of heat from the sun and from shame, but she didn't show it. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint, and in that restraint was power. Around her, the plaza remained still caught in a suspended moment between what had just happened and what would come next. But for Amara, the moment didn't need to go any further. It had already said enough. And standing there with her blouse torn and her dignity bruised but not broken, she understood something with absolute clarity. What had happened here was not about suspicion nor procedure nor public safety. It was about control. It was about stripping her presence down to a body that could be handled, diminished, silenced. And yet, she had not disappeared. She stood. She breathed. She looked him in the eyes. And in that stillness, surrounded by silence and broken cloth and hidden cameras, Amara Harper remained exactly who she was, and that was more than enough. He moved so quickly that no one had time to react, not even her. His hand clamped down on her wrist with a force that jolted her sideways, and before Amara could twist away or speak again, the second hand grabbed the front of her already torn blouse, yanking it downward in a motion so violent it didn't just tear fabric, it shattered air. The sound of it, a sharp, jagged rip, cut through the plaza louder than any siren. Her body arched reflexively, arms clutching her torso, trying to cover the sudden exposure, trying to protect what was hers in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. Time seemed to slow as her bare skin caught the midday sun, and in that moment, Amara wasn't just humiliated, she was publicly deliberately unmade. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A child dropped his juice box. An older man cursed under his breath. Someone screamed Amara's name, but Cole didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on her chest, not with lust, not even with hate, just cold entitlement, like a man tearing open a package he believed he had already paid for. The crowd, stunned for a second too long, began to shift from confusion to fury. Phones lifted in trembling hands, people stepping forward and backward at once, as though no one knew whether to intervene or freeze. Amara's heart thudded so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She refused. She held what was left of her blouse together with one hand, her other trembling at her side, and she turned her face directly to him, eyes wide, not with fear, but something colder, deeper, betrayal, forged in the knowledge that nothing she had done, nothing she had said, nothing she had earned could stop this from happening. "Are you proud of yourself?" she asked, her voice low, and even but rough around the edges like it had been dragged through gravel. Cole didn't answer. His hand hovered in the air for a moment longer, like he didn't quite know what to do next, now that his impulse had finished playing out. Then, without a word, he took a half-step back, still posturing, still trying to control the room with nothing but his uniform and his anger. Someone shouted, "That's assault!" and the crowd finally surged forward, not with violence, but with presence. A nurse dropped to her knees, holding a hoodie out to Amara. A man with a cane stood between her and Cole. A teenager with tears in her eyes filmed every second, her phone clutched like armor. The air had changed. It no longer belonged to him. But even as the community moved around her, Amara couldn't move yet. Her limbs felt numb, her skin stung from the rip, and her mind reeled in slow motion, replaying what had just happened, like a scene from someone else's life. She was a doctor, a decorated physician. She'd served in field hospitals overseas. She had stood beside dying children and grieving mothers, and still found the words to comfort them. But here on this bright American street in the middle of a health fair she'd helped organize, she had just been reduced to nothing but a body in a uniformed man's way. "Don't touch me," she finally said as someone tried to steady her elbow, and though her words were not unkind, they were made of iron. "I'm okay. I need a second." She took the hoodie, pulling it over her head with deliberate care, smoothing it down, as though she could rebuild herself from cotton and breath alone. Then she straightened again, letting her shoulders square themselves into place. Cole looked around, suddenly aware that the dynamic had shifted. Eyes were no longer on her alone, they were on him, studying, judging, documenting. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, to spin this into something else. Protocol, resistance, confusion, but no one was listening. A woman near the front clutched her chest, muttering prayers under her breath. An older man, a veteran by the patches on his vest, stood stiffly recording with one hand and clenching the other into a shaking fist. Amara turned slowly to face the crowd, then back to Cole. "You need to leave," she said, and her voice did not waver. "You don't get to be here anymore." He stared at her for a beat too long, then turned away, not from guilt but from exposure. He moved through the crowd like a man walking underwater, his badge suddenly a weight instead of a shield. As he disappeared into the growing ring of onlookers, the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each second. Backup was on the way, but not for him. Amara stood rooted where she was, hoodie zipped up to her throat, hands clenched into fists, so tight her nails dug crescent moons into her palms. Her breathing slowed, but the weight on her chest remained. She looked around at the people who had witnessed her undoing, who had stood too still for too long and now finally had come closer. She didn't blame them. Not really. Most people don't know what to do when something sacred is broken right in front of them, but she knew exactly what she would do. She took one step forward, then another, not running, not fleeing, reclaiming space that had been taken. With each footfall, she felt the warmth of sun return to her face, the sound of traffic at the edge of the square, the rustling of leaves above her like applause that had waited until the end. Her body ached not from injury, but from impact, emotional, psychic, ancestral. She carried not just her own pain, but the collective memory of every woman who had ever been touched without consent, spoken to without respect, dismissed in her brilliance, stripped of her dignity. Still, she moved forward. And as the sirens drew near and the voices behind her shifted from whispers to resolve, Amara Harper reached into her pocket for her phone, not to call anyone, not yet, but to look at herself in the black mirror of the screen, to see her. Reflection. And remember one undeniable thing. She was still here, and she was not broken. It was the voice, not the sirens, not the shouting, not even the camera phones aimed like witnesses in every direction. It was the voice that made him freeze. Calm, firm, and sharpened by a lifetime of authority, it cut through the tension like a thread pulled tight. "Officer," she said, slowly and clearly, from just behind the crowd. "Step away, now." And just like that, the illusion of control slipped from his hands. Cole turned instinctively, straightening his posture, but his eyes faltered as they landed on the source of the command. A woman no taller than his shoulder, with short silver hair and steady eyes that didn't blink under pressure, stood holding up a phone, recording everything with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't panicked, she was composed, and that scared him more than the crowd. She took one step closer, lifting her other hand to reveal a leather wallet, not bulky, not flashy, but unmistakable in its implication. The badge gleamed in the light like a verdict. "Judith Whitman," she said with a calm breath. "Federal judge. Retired, not irrelevant. I suggest you stop whatever it is you think you're doing before you add obstruction and battery to that list." For the first time since he laid hands on Amara, Cole hesitated, not because he understood, but because something instinctual warned him not to proceed. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Amara, standing a few steps behind him now in the borrowed hoodie, didn't speak either. Her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of someone swallowing pain. It was the silence of someone allowing the system to incriminate itself. People in the crowd began murmuring her name again, some repeating the word judge, as if it granted the moment more weight, more structure, more legitimacy. But Amara's legitimacy had never been the problem. It was just that now someone with power was finally naming it out loud. Cole looked around and realized he wasn't being supported, he was being watched. And not just by strangers, but by a woman with federal credentials, a camera phone, and the legal clarity to dismantle his entire defense in seconds. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered half-heartedly, though even he didn't sound convinced. The words landed like stones in water, heavy, pointless, and quickly sinking beneath the truth. "Then lucky for us," Judge Whitman said evenly, "we're recording exactly what it is." Her tone never rose, not once, and somehow that made every syllable more devastating. "You assaulted an unarmed physician in public at a community health event, and you did so without cause. You need to stop speaking, step away, and wait for your department to explain this mess to the press." Amara inhaled slowly and looked down at her hands, still faintly shaking from the adrenaline. She wasn't thinking about the footage. She wasn't even thinking about the judge or what might happen next. In that moment, her mind had gone somewhere quieter, somewhere inward, where all the layers of her identity converged. A doctor, a daughter, a black woman standing half-exposed on a city sidewalk, having been stripped not by accident but by decision. She wondered how many more times it would happen in her life. How many times dignity had to be rebuilt from the outside in. "I'd like to file a report," she said softly, almost too softly, as if unsure if the words mattered anymore. "They'll take your statement," Judge Whitman nodded, "and I'll make sure it lands in the right place. A man in the crowd finally stepped forward, older, tall, and wearing a navy blue polo with a patch from the local fire department. He placed himself between Cole and the judge, not aggressively but with unmistakable intent. "I think you should wait in your vehicle, officer," he said, his voice deep but calm. "I'll stay here until backup arrives." Cole didn't argue. He turned and walked back toward his cruiser with a tight jaw and clenched fists, his shoulders still squared like a man trying to salvage pride from debris. No one followed him, no one stopped him, but no one looked away either. And in that kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need permission to speak, the damage had already been recorded. Amara sat down slowly on the edge of a concrete bench, her body aching in places she hadn't realized were tense. Judith approached, kneeling beside her, not as a judge, not as a witness, but simply as a woman who had seen too much to pretend anymore. She gently placed a hand on Amara's shoulder and offered her a bottle of water. "You don't have to speak now," she said softly. "But when you're ready, they'll listen. And if they don't, I'll make them." Amara took the bottle, her fingers brushing the cool plastic like it was an anchor. Her throat was dry, her breath still catching, but her spine stayed straight. She looked at Judith, studied the lines in her face, the quiet fire behind her eyes, and nodded once. "Thank you," she said, because it was the only thing that felt honest in that moment. Not for the badge, not for the rescue, but for the reminder that some people, even in a broken system, still chose to stand between violence and truth. And as the sun dipped slightly behind the edge of the buildings, casting long shadows across the plaza, Amara leaned forward and rested her elbows on her knees. Her body trembled not from fear but from the release of tension long held. Around her the plaza began to breathe again, the murmur of voices, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of city life creeping back into frame. But she wasn't ready to move yet. Not quite. She stayed seated, steadying her breath, watching the breeze lift the edges of a discarded flyer at her feet. It spun once, then settled again, like her, not gone, just grounded. She didn't plan on speaking again, not right away, not in that moment, but as she stood there with the hoodie zipped tight to her neck and her fists curled just inside the sleeves, Amara could feel the silence thickening around her like fog, settling over water. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of 100 held breaths, all waiting to see what she would do next. And even though her body still ached with adrenaline and humiliation, something steadier began to rise in her chest, something she didn't expect, a quiet sense of ownership, not just of her body but of the moment itself. A low murmur stirred behind her voices, blending footsteps shifting on the warm concrete. She turned slowly and saw them, not a mob, not a crowd, but people, neighbors, strangers, patients, children still holding popsicles that now dripped forgotten down their hands. They weren't gawking anymore. They weren't frozen. They were watching her like they'd never really seen her until now, not just as a doctor or volunteer, but as something whole and breakable and still standing. "Are you all right, Dr. Harper?" a voice asked, gently breaking through the hush like a pebble in still water. It was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with short silver curls and tired but kind eyes. She didn't reach out, didn't touch, just waited like someone offering space instead of intrusion. Amara nodded once, not trusting her voice, and then nodded again with more certainty, as if the act itself could convince her body to follow her mind's lead. "I'm okay," she finally said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you for asking." Behind her, someone began picking up the medical supplies that had spilled when her bag hit the ground. Earlier boxes of gloves, unopened alcohol wipes, a crumpled pack of surgical masks. A boy of maybe 13 gathered them carefully, placing them back one by one, his hands moving slowly, like he was afraid of breaking anything else. He didn't say a word, but when he met her eyes briefly, his expression said, "Everything, I'm sorry. I saw it. I won't forget." Amara gave him a small smile, not forced, not performative, just enough to acknowledge the exchange. Then she bent down to help, crouching beside him as they reassembled the contents in silence. It felt grounding somehow, returning to the small practical tasks she'd begun the day with, as if each bandage and bottle she placed back into her bag helped sew something back together inside her. "I didn't think I'd have to fight today," she said quietly. Not really to anyone, just letting the words out to see how they felt once they were no longer trapped in her chest. "You shouldn't have had to," another voice answered, this time deep and calm. She looked up to see a tall man, black, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a faded paramedic shirt, and a gentle grimace that seemed built from decades of seeing too much. "But you did," he continued, "and we saw it. All of it, every second. Amara rose, slowly brushing the dust from her knees. The plaza looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The brightness of the sun didn't sting quite so harshly, and the buzz of voices no longer felt like static. Her own heartbeat had begun to even out no longer, racing, just pulsing steady like a low drumbeat in her chest, reminding her she was alive and, more importantly, unbroken. The boy who had helped her handed her the last item, her hospital ID, now slightly scratched but still intact. She clipped it back to her lanyard without looking away from him. "You did good," she said. "Thank you for helping." He nodded quickly, then stepped back into the crowd where his mother pulled him close, her arm wrapping around his shoulders with a fierce protectiveness that felt too deep for words. Amara looked over to where Officer Cole had been standing and saw only emptiness, now just footprints, a scuff mark, and the lingering tension of where violence had almost escalated, but didn't. She turned away from it. Not to forget it, not to erase it, but to choose where to place her attention, and what she saw next made her breath catch slightly, not from fear but from something close to relief. A small circle had formed around Judge Whitman, who now stood with her phone, lowered but still in hand, explaining calmly to two arriving officers what had happened, what had been captured, and what they would be responsible for if it was ignored. The officers, both younger, both visibly uncomfortable, nodded along, jotting notes, asking questions but careful not to interrupt. The authority in Judith's presence was quiet but absolute, like someone who had spent her life making people listen without ever needing to raise her voice. Amara didn't approach. She didn't need to. The work was being done. The truth was already unfolding in multiple frames per second, recorded and backed up on phones, in minds, in muscle memory. Her story had entered the world, and this time it would not be silenced. Instead, she turned her attention back to the people closest to her, the ones who had stepped forward when it mattered, the ones who had bent down, reached out, or simply stood still beside her when everything else had collapsed. She scanned each face, slowly breathing them in, as if their witness had somehow stitched her back together. "Thank you," she said, not loudly but with depth, her voice carrying just enough to reach those who needed to hear it. "Thank you for standing with me." And with that, Amara took a step back, lifting her bag once more over her shoulder, the weight no longer feeling quite so heavy. The wind shifted then, not dramatically, just enough to move a strand of her hair across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear and looked up, letting the sunlight touch her skin, letting the moment be exactly what it was. Not vengeance, not closure, but clarity. She had been stripped, yes, humiliated, yes, but not erased. And now, fully clothed, fully seen, she stood beneath the same sky, with nothing to hide and nothing left to prove. She didn't know exactly when the shift happened, when the raw sting of what had been done to her became something steadier, heavier, but strangely grounding. Maybe it was when she zipped the hoodie over her chest and felt the soft fabric catch against her skin, not to cover shame, but to reclaim space. Or maybe it was when she looked around and saw the faces, not just those holding phones or murmuring in disbelief, but the ones who had stepped forward without needing to be asked. The nurse who held out the hoodie, the boy who gathered her scattered belongings, the judge who didn't flinch, and the man who simply stood between her and the officer, not as a hero, but as a neighbor, refusing to be silent. Amara's breath slowed as she scanned the plaza, no longer focused on the gaping silence that followed the assault, but on the people who refused to look away. She could feel their presence now, not as bystanders, but as witnesses holding the moment together like stitches on torn fabric. And beneath her ribs, something like clarity began to form. Not peace, not yet, but an awareness of how deep the fracture went, and how powerful it could be to stand still in the middle of it without falling apart. She adjusted her stance, planting her feet slightly wider, grounding her weight the way she had done in crowded emergency rooms and unstable field hospitals, where the difference between chaos and control often came down to posture and breath. And even now, in the open air under a summer sky, surrounded by a trembling community, that muscle memory kicked in. Stay calm, stay present, stay standing. "Are you hurt?" someone asked softly beside her. It was Mrs. Eula, her white Sunday gloves now smudged with dust, her eyes still sharp beneath her broad-brimmed hat. Amara turned to her and shook her head gently, her voice steady but quiet. "Not the kind you can see." Mrs. Eula nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line, then reached out and took Amara's hand. Not in comfort, not even in pity, but in a gesture so full of history that it made Amara's throat tighten. It was the kind of touch that said, "I know," The kind that carried echoes of marches and back doors and prayers whispered into the hollow of injustice. It wasn't sympathy. It was solidarity. Amara squeezed her hand back just once, then let go, wiping her palms on her slacks before kneeling beside her scattered tote. She reached inside, pulling out a stethoscope tangled around a bottle of sanitizer, and began organizing things again. Methodical, deliberate, a doctor's instinct for order, asserting itself amid emotional wreckage. Each item returned to its place like a small act of resistance, a quiet refusal to let him take anything else from her. But her hands trembled still, just enough that she had to pause. The kind of tremble that doesn't come from fear but from restraint, from holding in everything you're not allowed to say out loud. She looked up and caught the eye of a young man recording from just a few feet away. Their gaze met for a long second, and without a word he lowered his phone. He didn't put it away, just held it at his side, as if saying, "I've got your back, but I'm not here to consume you." It struck Amara then how often black women carried the burden of dignity while navigating outrage. How the world demanded they be composed even while being broken open. How they were expected to turn trauma into teaching moments, pain into poise, injustice into inspiration. And yet, standing here violated, exhausted, but still upright, she felt no obligation to perform any of it. Not today. Not for them. Just for herself. She closed the zipper of her bag, stood up slowly, and turned toward the officer's empty spot, like she might see the ghost of him still lingering in the air. But all that remained was silence and the sharp, invisible edges of what he had tried to leave behind. Still, she didn't flinch. The damage was real, but so was her presence. From behind her a voice rose, not loud, not rehearsed, just honest. "You didn't deserve that." Amara turned and saw a woman in scrubs, maybe mid-40s, standing with arms crossed and tears at the corners of her eyes. None of it. Not a second of it. Amara met her gaze, nodded once and said, "Thank you." 2 words, but full enough to close a circle between them. Then, for the first time since it all happened, she let herself close her eyes. Just for a moment. Not to escape, not to hide, but to breathe, to gather herself from the corners she'd scattered into under the weight of his hands and the eyes of the crowd. When she opened them again, the plaza was still there. The sky hadn't changed. The damage hadn't disappeared, but neither had she. Her voice was soft, but carried when she spoke again, this time to no one in particular. "I'm still me," she said, not defiantly, not as a banner, but as a truth that needed to be spoken aloud. "And I'm still standing." And as the breeze moved through the square, lifting the edges of flyers and skirts and sun hats, Amara Harper adjusted her shoulders once more, tucked her bag under her arm, and stood in the stillness she had earned, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a woman who refused to vanish. The sound of tires rolling across the hot pavement broke through the stillness, first low and deliberate, not rushed, but unmistakably present. 2 patrol cars curved slowly around the edge of the plaza, their lights spinning, but sirens silent, like a warning whispered instead of shouted. The crowd didn't part for them so much as they stepped aside together, an unspoken agreement that space would be given but not reverence. Amara stood at the center of it, all her arms folded tightly across her chest. Now not to protect herself, but to hold everything in that hadn't yet found words. She watched the doors open, almost in sync, and 2 officers emerged, one white, one black, both younger than Cole, both noticeably cautious. Their hands hovered near their belts but didn't rest on them, and their eyes scanned the crowd, not with authority, but with wariness, as if they had walked into a room where something sacred had already been broken. They made no announcements, no calls for calm. They didn't need to. This wasn't chaos. It was aftermath. One of them stepped forward and spoke gently, his voice unsure but polite. "We were told there was an incident involving an officer." He didn't say assault. He didn't say misconduct. Just incident, as if trying to soften something that could never be made soft. But Judge Whitman had already moved to intercept them, her frame small but posture unshakable, and her tone left no room for interpretation. "There was more than an incident," she said, handing over her phone. "There was a violent abuse of power witnessed by dozens and recorded in full. I expect this footage to be entered into evidence without tampering or delay." The officer hesitated for only a moment, then nodded, accepting the phone like it held something radioactive. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the black officer beside him leaned slightly forward, his eyes locking briefly with Amara's from across the space. There was something unspoken in that glance. Not pity, not even solidarity, but recognition. He didn't nod. He didn't look away. He just saw her. Amara didn't move. Her body felt heavy in the heat, her legs aching with the effort of holding still for so long, but she wasn't ready to sit again. Not yet. Her grip tightened slightly around her forearms as the officer turned his attention to her, stepping a little closer, slowly, respectfully. "Dr. Harper," he said carefully, using her name as if it were both title and apology. "Would you be willing to give a statement? You don't have to now. We can give you time. We can do this later if you need." She paused, measuring her breath. "I'll speak," she replied, her voice quiet but certain, "but I want it on record that I'm speaking not as a victim, but as a citizen who expects accountability." The officer nodded. "Understood," he said. "Whenever you're ready." She looked around, scanning the plaza again, noting the faces still watching, still present. Children had been ushered back behind tables, and some vendors had resumed quiet tasks, but no one had left. No one had forgotten. And Amara felt that truth settle in her spine like a second backbone. They were waiting to see what justice looked like in real time. "I'll give my statement here," she said. "Not in a car, not in some hallway. Here." The officer hesitated, glanced at his partner, then back to her. "Here is fine," he said. So she began. She recounted every detail with the clarity of someone who had trained her mind to catalog trauma clinically, who could describe symptoms and sequences with precise language, even when her own body was the subject. But this was not detached. This was not sterile. She spoke slowly, her words measured not to withhold but to ensure nothing could be misquoted. Nothing could be rewritten into a version that made what happened easier to swallow. And as she spoke, people listened. Not just the officers, but the crowd, the elders who had marched before her, the youth who would one day remember her name, the neighbors who would retell this day, with a level of reverence usually reserved for history books. She finished, not with anger, not even with pain, but with a final quiet sentence that wrapped itself around the moment like ribbon on a wound. "This won't end here," she said, "but it starts now." The officer clicked off his pen, closing the notepad, his face unreadable, but his hands visibly tense. "Thank you, doctor," he said, voice low. "We'll make sure this goes through the proper channels." She nodded once, then stepped back, allowing the air between them to fill again. The plaza had grown quiet once more, but it was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of reverence. And then, just as she was about to retreat toward the shade, she felt a hand graze her shoulder gently. She turned and saw Marcus Delaney, the retired U.S. Marshal, broad-shouldered and solemn, standing with the kind of presence that didn't require introduction. "I've seen worse," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But not often, and not like that." Amara looked at him, unsure what to say. "I didn't think it would happen here," she murmured, "not like this." Marcus nodded slowly. "It always happens somewhere. But not always with this many people watching." And as he stepped back, folding his arms, guarding the space like a sentinel, Amara exhaled, long, full, and steady. Not because it was over, but because she had spoken. Because someone had listened. Because the ground beneath her feet still held. The sun had shifted slightly, casting a new line of shadow across the plaza, stretching long and clean past her shoes. She glanced down, noting how sharp the outline was, how clear it looked against the concrete. That she thought is what truth feels like. Defined, unmoving, and impossible to erase. She didn't notice the quiet at first, only that the voices around her had softened into something slow and reverent, like the final note of a hymn held just a second longer than expected. Amara stood at the center of it all, her body still sore in places where adrenaline had faded and tension now bloomed, but her mind fully present. The plaza had shifted from a scene of confrontation into a field of waiting, as if everyone there was holding the same unspoken question in their chest. What happens now? She looked around and realized they weren't just waiting for answers. They were looking to her for how to carry what they'd just witnessed, not out of expectation but out of shared weight. The kids had grown quiet again, clinging to parents' sides, and even the folding chairs creaked less as people shifted to get a better look. Vendors behind their tables stopped arranging flyers. The breeze moved slowly through the oak trees above rustling branches, with a whisper-like breath drawn in, and not yet released. Across from her, near the flagpole that marked the entrance to the plaza, someone was still filming, not with the intensity of someone chasing virality, but with the solemn steadiness of someone documenting truth. The camera didn't waver. It didn't zoom. It just watched as if to say, "This matters, every second of it." Amara adjusted the strap of her tote bag on her shoulder and took one small step forward, not to leave, not yet, but to make clear she hadn't been diminished. Her steps were measured, her spine tall, her gaze unflinching, and as she moved, people stepped aside for her again. But this time it wasn't out of fear or shock, it was out of respect. To her left, she saw Mrs. Eula seated in her chair again, hands folded tightly over her lapjaw, clenched with that quiet fury that comes from seeing history repeat itself one too many times. When their eyes met, the older woman gave a single, slow nod, nothing more. Amara understood it as both blessing and burden. One of the volunteers stepped forward, a young woman barely out of college, her hands fumbling slightly as she offered a fresh water bottle. "I just wanted to say," she said, voice shaking a little, "that what you did, how you stood there, it meant something." Amara took the bottle and smiled, though her lips barely curved. "I didn't stand for meaning," she replied. "I stood because I had to." The girl looked down, then back up again. Sometimes those are the same thing. And Amara didn't argue because she knew there was truth in that too. She moved toward the center bench, one of those old concrete ones with chipped paint and years of names carved into its back, and sat carefully, feeling every muscle in her legs release one by one. It wasn't exhaustion, not fully. It was the letting go that comes after holding yourself still for too long. The air felt thicker down here, the sun warmer on her arms, and yet she didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not before the last piece of the moment settled into place. Across the plaza, she saw Captain Lionel Grant arriving. His car had just pulled up alongside the curb, unmarked but unmistakable. He moved like someone who knew he was late, to something important, not because he hadn't cared, but because he hadn't known how quickly it would unfold. His eyes scanned the square until they landed on her, and he didn't stop to ask questions. He just approached. "Amara," he said, kneeling slightly beside the bench, his voice lower now, like someone speaking in a chapel. "I just heard." She turned to him and let the silence stretch, not out of anger, but because silence sometimes says more than words. When she finally spoke, her voice was even. "It happened. In front of everyone." He nodded, looking down, shame flickering across his features before he could hide it. "We'll take it from here," he said, but his words felt too simple for what needed to happen. "No," she replied, not cruelly but clearly. "You'll start here, and you won't stop until something actually changes." He met her eyes again, and for a long second he didn't speak. Then he gave the smallest, most sincere nod. "Yes, ma'am." Amara turned away, then not to dismiss him, but to look back at the plaza, this place that had always been about community and healing, and now had become something else. A scene of reckoning, a crossroads, a marker. She wondered how long the people here would carry it, how long their children would remember that this was the square where it happened, where a woman in a blue blouse had her dignity torn and rebuilt, in full view of a city that could no longer pretend. She didn't need to speak anymore. Not right now. The words were already moving in other mouths, echoing through phones, threading into conversations that would reach corners she'd never walk into herself. And in that she felt a strange comfort, not relief, not pride, just quiet certainty that she had done what needed to be done. As the breeze picked up again, and the shadows shifted across the pavement, Amara let her hand rest on the bench beside her. The concrete was warm beneath her fingertips, solid and still, and etched, just below where her palm landed, worn but still legible, was a name: Harper. She didn't know who had carved it or when or why, but for one small moment she allowed herself to imagine that whoever had been here before had survived something too. She looked up, eyes soft but sharp, and whispered to no one in particular, "We've been here before, and we're still here." And with that, she closed her eyes, not in retreat but in affirmation. She didn't need to see any more to know exactly who she was. By nightfall, the video had circled the internet like wildfire caught in dry brush, igniting timelines, group chats, and news feeds with a velocity Amara could never have prepared for. She hadn't checked her phone in hours, hadn't scrolled, hadn't read a single headline, but the ripple had reached her long before she'd seen the wave. Someone from the crowd had told her quietly, in a voice laced with disbelief, and something like reverence, "You're trending." She didn't know how to respond to that. What kind of sentence was that to say to a woman who'd had her body violated in public? She sat on the edge of her bed now, back at home, the room dim and still, the only sound, the low hum of the ceiling fan clicking softly with each rotation. Her hoodie was folded neatly over the dresser, and her torn blouse, what was left of it, sat in a paper evidence bag across the room. Her hands rested in her lap, palms up, fingers slightly curled. as if waiting for something to land there, something real, something to hold on to that wasn't just memory or noise. And in that quiet between exhaustion and clarity, she began to realize that she hadn't just become a witness, she had become the story. Her phone vibrated again, a soft buzz against the blanket beside her, and she glanced down to see a stream of messages, news anchors requesting interviews, lawyers offering representation, activists tagging her in solidarity, and strangers sending her paragraphs of gratitude, rage, or both. She tapped the screen once, then locked it again. Not yet. Her soul wasn't ready to be consumed in pixels and sound bites. Not while her breath still carried the weight of everything that had been taken and everything that had been given back. Across the room, her reflection stared back at her in the mirror. Shoulders, squared jaw, slightly tight, eyes red but dry. There was something unsettling about seeing herself in full, again whole but different, like a version of her had been peeled away on the plaza pavement and left behind. But underneath it, deeper than the bruises or the fear, there was something she hadn't expected: resolve. When the knock came at her door, it was soft, almost hesitant, followed by a familiar voice. "It's me, Judith," said her tone low. "I brought tea." Amara rose, her joints aching slightly, and crossed the floor with slow steps. When she opened the door, the older woman stood there, in a long coat, holding 2 paper cups and a manila folder tucked under one arm. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen too much of the world to be startled by its ugliness anymore. "I figured you might not be sleeping yet," she said simply. "I'm not," Amara replied, stepping aside to let her in. They sat in silence at first, each holding their cup, letting the warmth fill the space where words hadn't yet formed. Judith placed the folder on the coffee table without explanation, but Amara didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she watched the steam curl from the lip of her drink and asked the question that had been circling in her chest all evening. "Why did you step in?" Judith looked at her, the lines around her mouth tightening, not from anger but from memory. "Because I knew what would happen if I didn't," she said. "Because I've seen it happen before. And because this time I was close enough to say something while it still mattered." Amara nodded slowly, the truth of it settling around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She sipped her tea, the chamomile bitter and grounding, and let the silence stretch. "There's going to be more," Judith said after a moment. "The department's issuing statements. The mayor already called a press conference. They're trying to control the narrative before it controls them." Amara tilted her head, the corner of her mouth lifting with bitter irony. "They're too late." Judith gave a small smile, tight, measured. "They always are." For a long moment they just sat there, 2 women from different generations, connected not by politics or profession, but by something more elemental: resilience. The kind you don't teach, only inherit or earn. Amara looked at the folder again, then finally reached for it, flipping it open to see printed screenshots of comments, clipped headlines, and a few printed threats already circulating in the darker corners of the internet. "I thought you should see what's coming," Judith said, "not to scare you, just so you're not blindsided." Amara flipped through a few pages, her eyes scanning the worst of it with the cool detachment of someone reviewing a patient's trauma chart. "They're scared," she murmured. "They don't know how to handle a black woman who doesn't apologize for surviving." Judith nodded. "Exactly." Amara closed the folder, laid it flat, and leaned back. The room was still. The night outside had grown deeper, the city lights muted through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor like bars of soft light. She exhaled slowly, not to release tension but to acknowledge it. "I'm going to speak tomorrow," she said. Judith raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. "I don't want to be the symbol," Amara continued. "I don't want to be the next face they post until the next outrage comes along, but I am going to speak, because my silence isn't going to protect me either." Judith leaned back, setting her tea down, her expression unreadable but proud. "Then you speak, on your terms, no one else's." And in that moment, as the clock ticked softly in the background and the weight of the world hovered just outside her door, Amara Harper made peace with one simple truth. She hadn't chosen this fight, but she would finish it. Not because she wanted to be brave or loud or legendary, but because somewhere in the middle of it all, when her blouse had been ripped and her dignity challenged, she'd realized something no one could take. Her voice belonged to her, and she knew exactly how to use it. The press conference was set for 11 in the morning, but by 10:15, the room was already packed shoulder to shoulder with the kind of quiet tension that settles when people know they're about to witness something more than just a statement. The municipal briefing room wasn't large, just rows of metal chairs, a podium draped in navy cloth and a backdrop bearing the city seal. But it had become something else that morning, something heavier. Cameramen checked their framing for the 5th time, reporters whispered into microphones, and citizens leaned forward in folding seats, clutching notepads, phones, or each other's hands, like they were bracing for an impact they could already feel coming. Behind the thin curtain partition, Amara stood facing her reflection in the glass window, not to admire or correct but simply to look. The reflection staring back wasn't fragile, but it wasn't invincible either. It was human, and that mattered more. Her suit jacket, a soft charcoal gray, was buttoned clean over a high-collared blouse, and her hands rested quietly at her sides. Not clenched, not fidgeting, just still. Judith sat nearby in one of the back chairs, hands folded over her lap, waiting without words, offering nothing more than presence. "You don't have to explain anything you're not ready to," Judith had said earlier that morning over black coffee and silence. "I know," Amara replied, "but I think I'm ready to say what needs to be said." Now, as the minutes crawled toward the hour, she closed her eyes for a brief moment and let herself breathe, not performatively, not for calm, but to remember who she was underneath the expectations. A doctor, a daughter, a woman who had been publicly violated and had stood her ground. A voice that could no longer be framed as just a victim's. When the aide peeked in and gave her a small nod, Amara walked toward the podium with a steady rhythm, not fast, not dramatic, just sure. The room fell silent before she spoke. Flashbulbs didn't pop, but phone cameras shifted toward her like sunflowers to light. She scanned the room once, then took the mic, her fingers grazing the edge of the stand for just a second, grounding herself like a pulse taken on steel. "My name is Dr. Amara Bell Harper," she began, and her voice carried not loud but resonant with a clarity that didn't waver. "What happened to me was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a miscommunication. It was an assault, deliberate, violent, and unjustified." No one moved. "I stood in a public plaza," she continued, "offering free medical services to my community when I was targeted, humiliated, and physically violated by a police officer who chose not to see a physician, a neighbor, or a human being, but a threat." She paused, letting the weight settle. "This is not about one officer. This is about a system that makes what happened to me possible, common even, and that protects it with silence, paperwork, and practiced indifference." A murmur rippled through the room, but she didn't stop. Her words came from somewhere deeper now, from a place that knew how to stitch wounds invisible to X-rays. "When I refused to be silent, when I stood my ground, I became part of something larger than my own pain. I became a reflection of every person who's been told to lower their voice, hide their anger, or accept their dehumanization for the sake of peace that never really protected them." She glanced down briefly, then back up. Her tone softened, but it held. "I want accountability, but I also want more than that. I want policy. I want transparency. I want every officer who touches a civilian without cause to know they will be seen, they will be named, and they will be held to the standards they swore to uphold." A young journalist raised her phone a little higher, her eyes wide-lipped, trembling. The back row of the audience had gone completely still. Even the mayor, seated along the side wall, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And to those who saw what happened and didn't look away, Amara said, voice lowering with intention, "Thank you. To the woman who gave me a hoodie, to the boy who picked up my stethoscope, to the people who stood recorded and demanded truth, you reminded me that dignity is not given, it is protected." She let the silence sit for a moment, not to dramatize, but to let them breathe with her. "I am not here today to be turned into a symbol, a headline, or a trending hashtag," she said finally. "I am here because I have breath in my lungs and fire in my chest, and I will use both." She stepped back from the microphone gently, her posture never breaking, her hands still calm, her chin slightly raised. There was no applause, not right away. Just a moment of collective stillness, the kind that only happens when a room knows it's just witnessed something that cannot be taken back. Then slowly someone stood, then another, and then the sound of hands meeting filled the space, not in celebration but in confirmation. A standing ovation, not for survival but for truth spoken without compromise. Amara didn't bow, she didn't wave. She simply stepped away from the podium, returned to the back of the room and sat beside Judith again. Her hands rested in her lap once more, her breath, even her body tired, but her voice she knew now had only just begun. By the end of that week, something in the city had shifted, not in volume or chaos, but in temperature, in tone, in the way people looked at each other across sidewalks and courtroom hallways. It wasn't just about Amara anymore, not really. It was about what she had exposed, what she had endured publicly, and how she had refused to let anyone else rewrite the narrative of what had happened to her. The plaza where the incident had taken place had been cleaned, the chalk marks washed away, the overturned folding chairs packed up, but the echo of that afternoon still lived in the air. You could feel it when you walked past the weight of something that had cracked but didn't collapse. Amara sat alone in the back row of the council chamber that morning, hands folded in her lap, watching through lowered lashes as the members of the review board took their seats one by one. There were no cameras this time, no microphones, no trending hashtags, just old carpet, slow ceiling fans, and the stiff formality of bureaucracy trying to perform justice without showing its seams. The room smelled faintly of dust and coffee, and the creak of worn leather chairs filled the space as the hearing prepared to begin. Across the aisle, Officer Cole sat between two attorneys, his posture tense, jaw tight, and hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned a pale, sour pink. He didn't look at her, not once, and that was fine. Amara hadn't come for confrontation, she had come for confirmation. Confirmation that her truth had not drowned beneath the politics, the reports, the institutional choreography that so often muted stories like hers into administrative noise. The board chair, an older man with glasses that slipped down his nose every few minutes, cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was polite, practiced, and utterly detached, as if he were narrating a procedural manual rather than leading a hearing about a public assault. Amara listened quietly, letting the rhythm of his words wash over her, not because they comforted her, but because they gave her time to think. She thought about the first time she ever set foot in a courtroom as a medical expert testifying for a child's welfare case, how she had felt nervous but purposeful. She thought about how different it felt, now sitting in the same kind of space, not as a trusted voice, but as the woman who had to relive her violation through exhibits and official statements. She took a breath and adjusted her shoulders, grounding herself again. When her name was called, she stood with the kind of stillness that came from being deeply rooted not just in truth but in clarity. She approached the podium slowly, deliberately, her heels quiet against the old tile, her expression unreadable but focused. The board members looked up, most of them already familiar with her face from the footage, the press conference, or the fallout. But none of them knew what it had felt like to live inside that moment. "I won't restate what happened," she began, her voice calm but unyielding. "You've seen it, you've read it, and if you didn't understand it the first time, that's not because I wasn't clear." There was a pause, and she let it stretch just enough to draw their attention in tighter. "I'm here because I need to know, what will you do with what I gave you, with what we gave you? Because it wasn't just my body that was stripped open that day. It was every assurance that dignity is protected, every belief that service earns safety, every illusion that credentials or professionalism could shield me from being reduced to an object of suspicion." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, pen tapping against his notepad. "I didn't come for vengeance," she continued, softer now but no less firm. "But I came for truth, and truth has to matter more than discomfort." She stepped back, returned to her seat, and folded her hands again, not to compose herself, but to mark the moment closed. What she had said couldn't be taken back. What they chose to do with it was on them. The deliberations went long, as they always did. Legal phrases were exchanged, paragraphs were read aloud, questions were raised about protocol training, departmental liability. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't fold her arms or look away. She simply weighted her spine straight, her gaze steady, knowing that part of power was enduring the process designed to wear you down. Finally, hours later, the verdict was read. Officer Bradley Cole was found to have violated departmental policy on multiple counts, including use of excessive force conduct, unbecoming, and failure to de-escalate. His badge would be revoked, and he would be dismissed from service immediately. There would be no criminal charges, at least not yet, but the ruling was public, final, and irreversible. The room stayed quiet. No applause, no tears, just a slow exhale, long and collective, like the city itself had been holding its breath for days. Amara stood once more, not to leave in triumph, but simply to leave. She gathered her bag, nodded briefly to the chairperson, and made her way toward the exit. As she reached the door, someone behind her called softly, "Dr. Harper." She turned. It was a young woman in uniform, probably new to the department, probably barely older than some of Amara's patients. She didn't say much, just, "Thank you, for staying, for seeing it through." Amara nodded, gave her a quiet smile, and said, "Thank you for watching." Then she stepped out into the sunlight where the heat of the day had begun to settle into the sidewalks, and the world felt no less broken but a little more honest. And sometimes that's where healing starts. She hadn't planned on attending the sentencing in person, not at first, not after everything, but when the day came, she woke before sunrise, sat for a long while with her feet on the hardwood floor, and realized that some moments, no matter how painful, deserve to be witnessed from the front row. The courthouse lobby felt colder than she remembered, even with the early summer sun bleeding gently through the windows, warming the marble floors in soft golden streaks. Her shoes clicked softly as she walked toward the courtroom, the sound muted by a deep hum beneath her ribs, an anxious energy she neither embraced nor pushed away. The hallway was quiet, filled mostly with murmuring voices and the rhythmic rustle of papers being passed between officials in dark suits. When she entered the room, heads turned but no one spoke. She wore no press badge, no witness sticker, no symbolic ribbon, just herself. Just Amara in a navy dress and a soft wool blazer, her chin lifted, her expression unreadable. She took a seat near the back alone but not unseen, and folded her hands gently in her lap as the doors closed behind her with a slow, final hush. The judge entered moments later, followed by the court clerk and a bailiff whose face betrayed a flicker of discomfort when he saw who sat in the gallery. Then the defendant was brought in. Bradley Cole didn't look like a man broken by justice. He looked like a man bracing against humiliation, still trying to will himself into control over something long since lost. His suit fit poorly, his tie was askew, and the small tremor in his hands was the only visible crack in an otherwise rigid mask. He didn't glance her way, not once. She didn't expect him to. The sentencing began with the expected procedural cadence: motions acknowledged, prior convictions listed, department records reviewed. It all felt strangely clinical, as if the court were dissecting a character from a story rather than addressing a man who had once grabbed her arm and ripped her blouse in the middle of a public square. Then the judge began reading the statement, his voice clear, even but not without weight. The defendant's actions, he said, were not only unjustified but emblematic of a deeper, corrosive culture of impunity within law enforcement. His decision to escalate, to use physical force without provocation, and to humiliate a civilian in a space meant for healing cannot be separated from the uniform he wore while doing it. Amara's eyes stayed fixed on the bench, but her body tensed with every word, not from pain but from recognition. These were words she had written into her own thoughts 1,000 times but never expected to hear from someone in power. This wasn't a speech designed for television. It was a reckoning recorded into the official record. And it mattered. When the sentence was announced, 5 years in state prison, no possibility of parole until 3 served, there was no applause, no gasps, no visible reaction, just a long, steady pause. The room didn't erupt. It breathed. The judge closed the file and looked up at the room. "Dr. Harper," he said, voice slightly softer, "now you are under no obligation to speak, but the court will give you space should you wish to do so." She didn't stand right away. She let the silence linger for a beat, then rose slowly, her palms brushing down the front of her skirt, her heels steady against the floor. The courtroom, though full, felt silent as a church. Even the air seemed to slow, as if listening. She walked to the front, placed her hand gently on the side of the podium, and lifted her gaze not to Cole, not to the judge, but to the room itself. "I didn't come here for closure," she began. "I came here to remind you that justice, when it happens, is not a favor, it's a right." Her voice was measured, smooth but low, and it carried not from force but from intention. "I came here to see it through, to witness the entire process, not because I needed to, but because I refused to let someone else carry the final word about what was done to me." Someone in the gallery cleared their throat quietly, but no one interrupted. "You've given him a sentence," she continued, "but I want to make clear that the damage he caused doesn't end here. My dignity wasn't something he could strip with his hands, but he tried, and that intent lives in the muscles of every woman who walks through public space and wonders if she's next." She paused, eyes scanning the room slowly. "But today, I am not afraid. I am not small. And I am not going away." She stepped back, offered no flourish, and returned to her seat with the same deliberate grace she had carried in. The judge nodded and announced a recess, his gavel striking once not with drama but with finality. The officers moved to escort Cole out of the courtroom, but before they reached the door, something happened. He turned slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet hers across the room. For the first time, and in that brief moment, there was no apology, no plea, no remorse, just a look, flat, stunned, and perhaps for the first time, fully aware that he had been undone, not by outrage but by presence, not by spectacle but by quiet, consistent, unwavering truth. Amara didn't break eye contact. She didn't need to say a thing. Then the door opened and he was gone. She waited a few more minutes, not because she was lingering, but because she didn't want to rush the last breath of the moment. She gathered her bag, stood and made her way toward the hallway, past whispers, nods, and glances that felt less like praise and more like acknowledgement. Judith met her outside, standing near a bench beneath the courthouse flag, and the two women exchanged no words, only a look that said, "We did this, and now we keep going." The sun was sharp, but not harsh, and the breeze moved gently through the magnolia trees lining the walkway. Amara inhaled deeply and let the warmth settle over her skin, grounding her once again in her own body, her own truth, her own voice. And as she walked away from the courthouse, heels tapping lightly against the concrete, her silhouette long in the afternoon light, she carried nothing with her but certainty. Not relief, not vengeance, just certainty. The following afternoon, Amara found herself walking the edge of the plaza, where it had all begun less out of ritual, and more from an unspoken need to place her feet where the storm had passed. The sun hung low behind the courthouse roof, casting a soft, golden warmth across the sidewalks, while cicadas buzzed in the distance like the pulse of the city itself refusing to quiet down. There were no banners, no microphones, no curious onlookers today, just her and the weight of memory stitched into the bricks beneath her soles, each one holding the echo of that moment like a stone holds heat long after the fire is gone. She wore her white coat again, not because she needed to work, but because it reminded her of who she had been before that day, before the uniform of a healer was treated as disposable by someone sworn to protect. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the coat pocket, where a folded slip of paper rested an email from the mayor's office, requesting a private meeting, a quiet apology, and a photo opportunity she had yet to answer. She knew the politics well enough to see it for what it was. They didn't want justice, they wanted closure without accountability, and she'd already decided she wasn't going to hand that to them. A few steps ahead, a familiar sound reached her ears, the soft voices of children laughing high-pitched and scattered, the way only children laugh when they know they are being watched and feel safe in that attention. She looked toward the source and saw them, 3 kids chasing one another around a pop-up tent, their sneakers thudding lightly against the pavement. Near them sat their parents, chatting in lawn chairs, hands nursing paper cups of lemonade. It was a community fair, again, smaller this time. No cameras, no police presence, just neighbors reclaiming space. She stood watching for a moment unnoticed, letting the warmth and noise settle over her like a gentle tide. Then she felt a hand on her elbow, light, hesitant. She turned to find Marcus Delaney standing beside her, the former U.S. Marshal who had witnessed it all and never once tried to explain it away. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice deep and even like gravel under a slow-moving tire. "Place has a memory now." She nodded, once her expression softening. "It always did. We just didn't always notice." He looked out across the square, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a folded newspaper under his arm. "They asked me to speak next week," he said at the town hall meeting. "Wanted me to talk about safety and public trust. You think I should?" Amara tilted her head slightly, considering. "That depends," she said. "You gonna tell them what they want to hear or what they need to—" He smiled without showing his teeth, a quiet acknowledgement that truth wasn't always welcomed, but sometimes it was owed. "You're better at that than I am," he said. "I'm just louder," she replied, "and more tired of being quiet." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a little girl help her younger brother up from a small fall, brushing gravel from his knee with one hand and hugging him with the other. Amara smiled faintly, then turned her gaze to the bench near the far edge of the plaza, the one where she had first sat down, shell-shocked and reassembling herself from the inside out. It was still there, faded and cracked its paint, peeling more now than before. Someone had placed a small pot of wildflowers beside it, unmarked but vibrant in their intention. She walked toward it slowly, Marcus staying behind as if he knew she needed to cross that distance alone. As she reached the bench, she didn't sit, not right away. Instead, she ran her fingers along the wood, the grooves familiar like old scars. The air around her felt still, not heavy, not light, just present. And in that presence, she allowed herself to feel what she had been too focused to notice these past weeks, how much she had carried, how many names had whispered through her thoughts, how many women she'd imagined standing behind her when she'd stood in front of the press, the courtroom, the mirror. She finally sat down, folding one leg over the other, letting her shoulders relax fully for the first time in days. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed slow and deep like someone reclaiming space inside their own body. A voice called out nearby young male, maybe 16. Dr. Harper. She turned. A tall boy approached, cautious but determined, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his hoodie. He looked familiar, one of the teenagers from the plaza that day, the one who had filmed from the steps, his phone steady as his voice trembled. "I just wanted to say, I saw what you did," he said. "I didn't know what to do in that moment. But I see you now, and I'm not going to forget it." Amara met his eyes, nodded once. "That means more than you know." He looked down at his shoes, then back at her. "My little sister's thinking of becoming a doctor. I showed her your speech. She said you made her feel brave." Amara placed a hand over her chest, a quiet gesture that said thank you without the need for repetition. He gave her a small wave and jogged back toward his friends. She sat a while longer, letting the moment settle, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the email again. She unfolded it, read the lines carefully, then tore it once cleanly, precisely, and let the pieces rest in her lap. Some invitations are not worth answering. A gentle breeze stirred the petals of the flowers beside her, and the late sun began to slide behind the rooftops. She stood, brushed off her coat, and turned once more toward the plaza, no longer a place of damage, but a place of record, of responsive rebirth. As she walked forward, her shadow stretched long behind her, connected to everything she'd endured, but never dragging her down. She moved with the certainty of someone who had been made into a headline and turned it into a homecoming, one slow step at a time. On the last Sunday of the month, Amara stood once again beneath the old oak tree that marked the edge of the plaza, her hand gently resting on the bark, as if to feel the pulse of something older than grief, older than justice. The plaza was quiet now, washed clean by 2 recent rains and softened by time, but the memory of what had taken place here hadn't faded, it had only changed shape. Where tension had once crackled in the air, there was now something calmer, something still. But it wasn't peace, not exactly. It was more like reverence, like the way a church falls silent after the final hymn has been sung and no one wants to be the first to leave. She wore simple clothes that day, no white coat, no formal jacket, just a navy sweater and soft gray pants. The kind of outfit that didn't invite attention but couldn't help holding it. Her hair was tied back low, and her eyes, though clear, held the weight of someone who had seen her own story played out on every screen, yet somehow managed to stay whole. The bench nearby, the same one she'd once sat on with her body shaking and her soul in pieces, had been replaced with a new one, clean wood and fresh bolts, and a small plaque affixed to its back. It read simply, "To those who stood when it would have been easier to kneel." There was no mention of her name, and she had insisted on that. Because the story wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who had witnessed it and everyone who had finally chosen not to look away. As she stood there, the soft sound of footsteps approached from behind, slow and deliberate, the kind of pace taken by someone unsure whether they're welcome but hoping to be. She turned slightly and saw Judith dressed in muted browns, holding a thermos in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "I brought scones," Judith said, her voice low and warm. "Fig and walnut. You look like you haven't eaten." Amara gave a soft laugh, the kind that barely lifts the corners of the mouth but carries warmth just the same. "You always know," she replied. They sat side by side on the bench, the wood still smooth. The sun filtered through the oak leaves, casting soft patterns on the ground. Around them, the plaza remained still but alive in quiet ways. A boy on a bike rolling past with a backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. 2 women walking a dog, their conversation low and steady like water in a slow stream. Judith handed her one of the scones and said nothing more for a while, letting the silence settle without trying to fill it. Amara took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then leaned back, allowing her shoulders to relax in a way they hadn't during any of the interviews, the court dates, or the community meetings. "It's strange," she said after a while, her voice almost thoughtful, "how something that breaks you open can also teach you how to stay whole." Judith didn't answer immediately. She just nodded once, then finally spoke. "That's how we pass strength down. Not by avoiding the fire, but by walking through it and telling others it can be survived." A breeze lifted, carrying the scent of something faintly floral, and Amara tilted her head up toward the sky, letting the moment stretch out. She didn't need to speak again, not yet. There was nothing new to say, no more outrage to offer, no final punchline to deliver. What mattered now wasn't how loudly she could speak, but how clearly she could live in the quiet that came after. She glanced toward the far edge of the plaza, where the mural had gone up last week, a series of silhouettes in soft, earthy tones, no faces, no names, just figures holding one another upright and interlinked. Community rendered in color, survival painted as permanence. The artist had asked for her input. She had given only 3 words: let them stand. And now they did. Judith stood first, brushing crumbs from her lap, and gently placed the rest of the scones on the bench between them. "For whoever needs one," she said, then smiled and walked slowly toward the street. Amara stayed behind for a few minutes more, watching a leaf drift from the tree and land soundlessly at her feet. She didn't move to pick it up. She didn't need to mark it. The wind would carry it somewhere, and that would be enough. She stood, stepped back from the bench, and took one last look across the plaza, not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but simply as herself. And then, with steady breath and unhurried steps, she walked forward, her shadow falling softly across the pavement, long and certain as the morning light stretched just a little farther across the ground. In life, there will be moments we never choose to walk into, but how we stand in those moments is what truly defines us. Amara's story isn't just about injustice. It's a powerful reminder that dignity cannot be taken away unless we surrender it. Even when she was hurt in front of a crowd, she didn't respond with rage. She responded with calm strength and wisdom. The lesson for all of us, especially those who've ever felt overlooked or dismissed, is this: your voice still matters, even when others try to ignore it. Walk with dignity, even when your knees shake. Because quiet strength, when held with conviction, can shift the conscience of an entire community. And if you're silently carrying something heavy right now, remember this: sometimes, just by standing your ground, the world around you begins to listen. If this story touched your heart or made you reflect on resilience and the power of your voice, take a moment to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We'll continue sharing deeply emotional, meaningful stories that remind us that at any age, courage and dignity remain a guiding light. Thank you for listening.